Hello, my name is Anna Littleboy, and I'm Research Director for a public-private partnership here in Australia that is looking to bring together mining companies, communities and governments to transform mining-dependent communities into sustainable post-mining futures. That in itself is an innovation for the future. Mine closure, we're told by the ICMM, is one of the most important risks facing the mining companies today. And innovation theory tells us that you can innovate not just in technology, which is what we tend to focus on, but also in processes and in institutions. Our partnership is looking at innovation on all three fronts to help make sustainable post-mining prosperity a reality. So what I want today is to look at the global trends driving us towards thinking about mine closure and how well we're doing this. And as a little teaser, I've put some images on this slide of mines that look great in terms of having been repurposed. But actually, if you delve a little deeper, none have actually been formally relinquished. The Acland mine in Queensland is still under the control of the mining company. Note the high vis that the rider of that horse is wearing. The Eden project in Cornwall, possibly the poster child for post-mining futures, it was actually developed in an abandoned quarry. And in Belgium, the coal mines and the coal mining territory was been transformed into a whole range of post-mining practices, but it's been done through government intervention. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this presentation, it's that closure doesn't necessarily mean relinquishment, and great environmental practice doesn't mean a mine is closable. So I doubt that anyone at this event will challenge the fact that closure and post-closure considerations are rising up the risk radar for mining companies. This is being driven by a whole range of global trends and drivers, which I'm not going to dwell on, but I think it is worth reminding ourselves of. Firstly, sustainable development and the sustainable development goals that have been put forward by the United Nations, which drive any operation which impacts on people and place to think about how to do that as sustainably as possible. They also underscore the need for continued production of minerals and metals, which is another reason why we need to be able to demonstrate that we can close the loop on the mining process. Secondly, expectations of performance against the Sustainable Development Goals are rising around the globe for any operation that has a very significant footprint around the world. And with that, the investment of funds into supporting these operations is changing. The number of funds under ethical investment guidelines tripled between 2016 to 2018, changing the way that finance is being invested to support capital projects. If we can't demonstrate that we can close our mines, why should we expect ethical investors to continue to invest in opening them? And thirdly, in mature jurisdictions such as Australia and Canada, we're seeing many mines reaching the end of their economic lifetime, raising the spectre of mine closure to previously unprecedented levels. Coupled with the very particular challenges being experienced by the coal mining industry as we transition away from fossil fuels to a renewable energy source, this means that closure has become a talking topic around the world. And of course, events such as Brumadinho, Samarco and Juukan Gorge have precipitated the industry to the forefront of public attention in a way that amplifies the risks from the industry and pays almost no regard to the benefits that accrue from the industry. Social expectations of transparency about mining operations, how they impact on local communities and how they affect the environment is at an all-time high. And all this is happening at a time when our certainty about the world, about the way it works, the way we connect together, where the key risks for our society lie, have been thrown into disarray by the onset of the global pandemic. Global uncertainty is higher than it's ever been. And all these issues have combined to create a mining industry that is now very concerned and interested in how it adds value outside the mine site into the local community and the local environs, and also how it can add value beyond closure and relinquishment into post-closure opportunities. In a sustainable development context, this is to be highly commended. But how well are we doing about that? Well, attention to closure is definitely increasing, as shown by this data, which is the number of cases of closure by year taken from the S&P Global Market Intelligence database. But if you look closer at the data, of the 1,804 mines identified as closed in that database, 1,700 of them are identified as inactive. Not much going on there. Only 2 are identified as actively relinquished. 50 are under rehabilitation and about 20 are in care and maintenance. A very, very small percentage, less than 5% of the closed mines identified in the database are actually actively pursuing action towards closure and relinquishment and repurposing. So I was really surprised by this data, and I decided to reach out to my network and ask for any and all examples, the best examples of mine closure and rehabilitation from around the world. And then I looked at them in terms of the ICMM definition of relinquishment, which is reproduced here. Many thanks to those who responded, but of the 43 examples that came through, precisely 2 met the spirit of the definition of relinquishment. There were a number of really fantastic examples of mine closure and repurposing and progressive rehabilitation. But at their heart, the mining company was still in there, running, managing, somehow controlling what was happening on the site. Of the examples where the mining company was no longer involved, significant state intervention had created mechanisms in order to effectively manage and repurpose liabilities. So this suggests a picture where sites that are still industry driven and regulated by government, there are many examples of great closure but not fully relinquished. There are many examples where a progressive closure is happening but they're not relinquished. Where sites have been maybe abandoned or somehow passed over to government control, there are many examples where other types of industry have come in to actually implement repurposing. So we see state-initiated management of old nationalised assets such as the coal mines, and there are examples of that in Belgium, Germany and the UK. And we actually see many examples of abandoned sites that have actually been repurposed. Eden Project, Butcher Gardens, and a number of other opportune sites. And this pattern is repeated in a much more comprehensive analysis of mine repurposing undertaken by colleagues of mine here at the University of Queensland. Sarah Holcomb and Julia Keenan actually analysed a range of projects from around the globe looking at the quality of repurposing that had taken place. And there they too found that where there was significant government intervention, you had much better repurposing outcomes from 148 case studies that they looked at in this piece of work. So what is holding us back? Why is it that we seem to be unable to move through this process of closure, through relinquishment to successful post-mining futures, particularly where we have responsible mining companies regulated by very sophisticated laws and policies? For me, the issue is that closure is not just an environmental issue. We're talking here about the transfer of tenure from one system of government, which is the mining system, to another, which is regional development and regional planning. And those systems are not always very well aligned. Environmental values in particular vary for different stakeholders, and the risks vary for different stakeholders. And we're just not managing to get those risks and values lined up in a way that is equitable for all the stakeholders who are involved in this transaction. This is very much a shared problem. Decisions need to be made through partnership between industry, governments and community representatives. Options for moving beyond closure require funding models. And provisioning to enable better outcomes means that the mining company has to be able to balance short-term considerations of productivity to longer-term closure outcomes. And although it's pretty clear that value can be created beyond mining through these post-mining outcomes, that value accrues to many, many different stakeholders in different ways. The repurposing of land, the repurposing of assets, employment and business opportunities for local companies and for others, ecosystem services, conservation values, indigenous stewardship, and social capital. This benefit is distributed very widely amongst many stakeholders. The cost of delivering this benefit tends to be laid at the doorstep of the mining industry. So this becomes quite an intractable problem, with inequality in the way benefits are shared amongst the different stakeholders, in the way costs are expected to be held by different stakeholders, in the way different stakeholders are impacted adversely or beneficially from post-mining opportunity, and in the way people assign accountabilities for that movement from mining into post-mining. And where you have an intractable problem, you actually need to look at innovation that is not only technological, but also challenges processes and institutions. The options for moving to a sustainable post-mining economy need to be feasible in terms of what the land is fit for. They need to be desirable in terms of what the community would like. And they need to be viable in terms of securing investment. So somehow we have to bring all of those things together into a single framework that is fit for purpose. This is not just an environmental issue. And at the CRC for Transformations in Mining Economies, we're working to look at making changes in 8 areas. We're looking to really inform regulatory excellence so that we can continue to morph the regulatory frameworks around mine closure so that we can actually effectively move from mine closure through relinquishment to post-mining futures for the region. We're looking to involve stakeholders very early in the development and delivery of post-mining options so that they have ownership in terms of making sure that those options can be made sustainable into the future. We're looking to understand not just how an individual mine impacts the region, but how combinations of mines come together to impact at a landscape scale, whether it's landforms, groundwater regimes, jobs and employment, infrastructure assets and energy. We need to think hard about what actually is the supply chain required for closure and post-closure. We can have all the best options in the world, but if the supply isn't there to make them sustainable, they will not be sustainable. So thinking about who do we need, what skills do we need, what businesses do we need, and what kind of resources and investment do we need to actually enable a sustainable post-mining future. We know quite a lot about technological solutions that can deliver positive impacts through closure. Why is it that we don't actually implement them as well as we can? How do we get into the psyche of the mine value chain and unpack decisions that are made pretty early on in operations that actually mean that we don't do the necessary innovation to mitigate risks before they happen, or to deliver opportunities right the way through the life of mine and beyond? How do we pull data in standards and norms that can be aggregated so that we can really actually project not just how the ecosystems are going to grow back now, but how they'll behave under climate change and into the future? And then how do we use that information? How does it feed back into thinking about the feasibility of different post-mining options? And finally, how do we actually get into and unpack the black box that is mine planning to really understand how is it possible to make changes in the way mining is conducted that will accrue benefit post-closure? How do we make that an attractive option with a business case for mining companies in order to ensure it happens? These are difficult and challenging questions. So I hope that in this presentation I've provided enough information to get you to challenge your assumptions about whether we have it right around mine closure. It's clearly a really important issue for the industry and for society as a whole. Until we can close mines, we can't confidently open mines, and therefore we can't confidently continue producing the minerals and metals that are required for today's society. But solving the issue is clearly not just about technology, and nor is it about brilliant environmental practice. We have to question whether we have our settings right, our processes right, and our institutions right to enable effective ending of the mining process, closure of the mine, handover of the mine, and transition into a post-mining future. And if we haven't got the processes right, what are the options? One option is the issue of perpetual obligation. And there's an example here of the Stiftung Corporation in Germany, which proudly manages perpetual obligations from the Ruhr Valley's coal mining industry. And it makes money while doing so. It's a different model. It's a model that is sustainable, and it's a model that's returning value back to Germany. It's also a model that at its heart actually has state ownership in the Stiftung company. I'm not advocating perpetual obligations on mining companies. What I am doing is suggesting that we actually really need to think creatively about how do we manage post-mining activity, and what is the role of governments, communities and industry in doing so. Because until we work that one out, we're going to continue having less than 5% of our mines around the globe actually relinquished for post-mining land use. And that's not a good track record. It's not a good legacy. Thank you very much for listening. If you wish to hear more about the Cooperative Research Centre for Transformations in Mining Economies, please visit our website. And I hope to take up some of these issues with you in conversation and in challenging inquiry. Good night.